Okay, go back here now to the, I think I may have already put most of the future slides that our hospital, for those who have not seen it or from outside, that's to do that, and that's a disclosure. So the objective of my talk today, to describe major evolutionary changes in cardiovascular disease prevention from ancient Egyptian time till modern era. Describe briefly what have we learned about cardiovascular disease prevention in modern era, and what the expectation for the future for preventive cardiovascular disease. Now, ancient history started with ancient Egyptian. Modern history originated in the early 1900s. This is the mummies, which I just mentioned to you, but which was studied recently in Egypt and published by a group from Dr. Greg Thomas from California, along with Egyptian, and it was very, very interesting finding to go to the museum in Egypt with CT scan and take pictures and CT scan on these old mummies. So what did they find? The testimony which he did, Dr. Thomas. If one had to be ill in ancient times, actually, the best place to do so would probably have been Egypt. Not that an Egyptian change's survival would have been significantly better than those of his foreign counterparts, but at least he had the satisfaction of being treated by physicians whose art was renowned all over the world at the time. See, here's the mummies when they went in the Museum of Cairo with a CT scan, and then what did he say at the end? Wealthy and elite ancient Egyptians ate a lot of fatty meals from cattle, geese, and ducks, and used plenty of salt for food preservations. And this is the one where they found the atherosclerosis and all that. So at the end, he said, it looks like we may have more in common with the great leaders of the ancient world than we so often think. And we all need to eat more fruits and vegetables. Now, the modern era now, we're going to talk about the modern history and divided it in 3 episodes. From 1900 to 1940, what have we learned from that time? And 1940 to 1970, that's a very interesting episode because that's the wartime. And you can see what the effect of the wartime, where the people could not get enough food, have affected the coronary artery disease. And then, of course, from 70 to now is the present. Now, so character and trait of pioneers, we need to know these people who will stand actually in their shoulders. They had keen observations, they had breadth of view, but the one I like best, vision beyond the laboratory and clinic to the socio-cultural influence on a disease and health. Who are these? These are some of the names which really have been very great on developing this idea that the Chinese listened to Western medicine, which was by Isidor Snapper, who was a Dutch physician, who was in China in the early 50s, and he found interesting that the Chinese have less coronary artery disease than the Western. And then he wrote his book, Chinese Lessons to Western Medicine. Now, what have we learned? Here you see, I will go briefly on that. It goes back to the 1900s when Marco Polo have showed that prevalence of cardiovascular disease varied among European, African, and Asian. So in his travel around, he found so that, see the cultural difference. The whole goes back to the 1900s when this observation made. That's Marco Polo during the. At the same time, they were observing marked difference in lifestyle, particularly eating pattern, and they began to make this intriguing association between the diet. So the diet, history, and all this thing goes back to the 1900s, this observation started. And then another Dutch physician later on has a lack of vascular disease among native versus Dutch colonial in his hospital ward. A Dutch physician was an Asian place hospital, and he saw that the Asian have less problem than the colonial Dutch. And they again associated that with the lifestyle and eating habits. That is Cornelius de Langen. De Langen was among the first to connect these disparate clinical findings with the cultural differences, particularly diet and lifestyle, and to demonstrate that modification of diet can independently affect characters and the cholesterol level, etc. So it goes back. It's not something we're talking about today. It's really goes back to the ancient time here, many decades ago. Now, this neighbor, which I just told you about, was a Dutch physician again in China who made this and wrote this book, which was published in 1941. Now, that's his Isidor Snapper here. His book influenced those studying the metabolic aspect of atherosclerosis, including Snapper Dutch colleague Goren. What did Goren do? She noted that, again, exercise and diet have much to do. So, around the same time, many of you don't know how long we have been blood pressure could we measure, don't know when the first ECG done. Interestingly enough, that helped. The industry also helped it back then, and indirect blood pressure medicine was, blood pressure measurement was already in the late 1800. Already was a pressure EKG in 1902. You know, here's this diagnostic tools. So this diagnostic tool helped these people also see people who had heart attacks and so forth, had abnormal EKG. Later on, this famous American, James Herrick, have showed experiment in dog and observation in patient that the diagnosis of acute MI is not always fatal, because they already could show that, you know, the ECG was normal, abnormal, back then, 1912. So what have we learned from 1940 to 1970? Wartime lessons. That's really which was very moving to for me when I read all the story about it. But also the wealth of information about the pathogenesis of coronary artery disease. By focusing on individual risk, start risk factor paradigm, Minneapolis business study, which was started in 1947, we'll talk about that later. Framingham started in 1948, we'll talk about that later. But focusing after that on the entire population difference. So here is this slide, look at carefully. The wartime. Before 1940, up there was high incidence of cardiovascular morbidity and disease. And during the wartime, could not eat well. And we'll talk about in Europe, okay? So dipped down. And this was also proven by Finnish study, where they went and get autopsy. And they found that people at that time have less atherosclerosis than the people before 1940. Even was even more than that interesting that a Swedish fellow physicians found that compared that with the US, where there was no wartime, no problem, they have high incidence of coronary artery disease as compared with Europe, where the poor lives could not afford to get this very, very disturbing food, meals, or so forth. That the wartime rationing, that has shown. So to us, we learn already from that very, very important information about the diet and the exercise and all that is nothing new. So the result of the Finnish study I just told you, 1940 to 1946, this declined significantly. They attributed this to diet. Diet low in fat, resulting in less coronary atherosclerosis. And this was the first to prove that atherosclerosis is a preventive disease and not degenerative disease. Just remember that. Similarly, studies shown subsequently from Sweden and Norway, where they showed decline in mortality from cardiovascular disease during wartime, which they attributed to dietary factor, versus the United States, which they were still eating this big hamburger and everything else. Now, what have we learned then? Decrease in mortality from coronary artery disease during wartime, and rapid rise thereafter in Europe as compared with USA, as shown in the study before. Also confirmation of less atherosclerosis in Finnish autopsy, as I told you, studied during the war as compared with that after the war and before the war. So this already, all this, what we're talking about already, that's observation and so forth. What that result in? Russian scientists in St. Petersburg were the first to explore dietary causes for atherosclerosis and proved it experimentally in animals by feeding them fatty diets. They also fed cholesterol to animals and showed that increased cholesterol in blood produced atherosclerosis. So there's no doubt about that. Now, so this Gorin here, the one I told you earlier, first to show that effect of cholesterol lowering, effect of unsaturated fat. I've been talking about that, but this thing already goes over 70 or 80 years ago. Here also showed that exercise is good. And blood pressure goes high up if you don't do these things. So really the fathers of cardiovascular disease epidemiology and cardiovascular disease prevention are these two names, Ansel Keys and Paul Dudley White. They focus the international interest on the evolving lifestyle hypothesis based on extensive travel in Europe and Asia and everywhere else. What did they find? Here they are. Because they found that on this travel, focused international interest on the evolving lifestyle hypothesis. So lifestyle hypothesis is very, very important, goes back to the old. So what that resulted in? Resulted now in stimulating now the epidemiologists and support to start to look now in Framingham, let us look at them about the risk factors and see what happened. And then also the 7 county side all over the world to go on. So pathophysiology underlying the heart attack grow out. Clinical observation, autopsy, the finished study, and experimental study. So heart disease diagnosis improved, its epidemic increase, recognized, and the epidemiological studies started to go on, begin in the mid-20th century. Many of you don't know that Framingham started in 1948, as a matter of fact, for 10 or 12 years, where they started to see this reason for that. That was the start of the Framingham study, cohort study to see risk factors, and then they came with the conclusion that the major risk factor, hypertension, hyperlipidemia, and smoking. Okay, so that is the Framingham study, which all of you should be familiar with. And then out of that, another study came, 7-country study. They started big around Japan and Greece and everywhere else. And what did they come up with? They found that the Japanese and the Greek have less coronary artery disease than the American and the Finnish, again, for the food and the diet. Good. So this is a very, very interesting. Now, so the Framingham started on, and then the risk score, and they came up with these conclusions. And what is the result after that all happened? Then the National Institute of Health came out and started to encourage research. And the World Health Federation, the American Heart Association, all that started now to give grants and so forth. Let us look around, how can we prevent the disease? Because we already learned from all these previous observations and finding that this is something we should do something about it. Okay, that the Heart Foundation, the American Heart and all that, and the World Health Organization and the Medical Research Council in the UK. Now, let us move now to 1970, present modern era. So lifestyle and biological causes of cardiovascular are firmly established. There's no question about that. Risk modification study tested, and to get to all this at the end have started to give grant and you file for it and so on. But that's just 1970 when the whole thing started. But really the foundation was in the early 90s till the 1970s. Now, I don't know what's happening here. Now, modern era, I don't think of public health. The Monica study, that's another study which is, I would like to call your attention for, from 1979 to 202. They studied to see what's the effect about this modifying the diet and the blood pressure and all that, and they reached the same conclusion that this is really something good, worthwhile. So this is then started to lead on what is really causing that. That's where the gene story started to look at the gene. And the gene actually started by mapping the DNA in 2003. Prior to that, there was no talk about gene and genomes and all that, which Dr. Kobeski talked about here today. So that is really the future here, looking at the gene, genetic, and biomarkers. Why? because they already learned that blood pressure control, smoking control, lipid control, still we have a residual risk. What else should we be looking for? And that is the future. Genomic is going to be the future, and biomarkers, which is going to be really the future. And we're looking for this additional process to try to find out how can we improve about our risk stratification. So the breakthrough made headline was in 2003 when they mapped the DNA. For you, our historian, then something is more interesting than that. Later on, I will show to you. And that this is here they found about that getting cholesterol down, improve the thing, hypertension down, then they approved it. Smoking, interesting, there was no study, but it was already approved. That is one of the major risk factors. Prevention in the first place. The kids start, look, early detect to protect. Okay. Now, until then, there was no medicine. Now, about the same time now, start medication now, the medicalization for prevention. And here at the end, read that behavioral changes was downplayed in research priorities. Legislative approaches languished in the new millennium. Statins came to be sold by the billions. And in 2003, the British Medical Journal even proposed editorially a holy pill of 6 lowering drugs and one as universal public health. We talk about poly pill today. That goes back already to 2003. So now decline, everybody knows that treating all these risk factors will improve, but still the residual risk, and that's what we need to look in the future. So there was early detection for optimal prevention study called the cardiac trial. What did the cardiac trial show? That was very interesting. All of you should. They looked people below, if they have below, before age 30, if they found that these people don't have optimal condition, no risk factor, interesting enough, later on, the very less of a problem. But if there were some risk factor, and then, so if you reach middle age and you don't have any of the risk factors, your likelihood that you have a problem is 46% cardiac-wise. So check your cardiac risk and all that. Now, of course, the guidelines started to be brought, and public policies and all that all came later because of all this, what we learned about it, then the policy implications and all for the future. Now, here there's a term which came with the American Heart recently, and you need to be familiar with that. We still can talk about gene. Gene is not alone. Gene just lost, unless the gene changed, and that change due to the life habit and everything else, called the expressed genome. The term which you should be familiar with, expressed genome, a new scientific statement from the American Heart that delves into a crucial component of the genome that you very likely never heard, the expressed genome. It is the combination of molecular level traits that can predict health and can be altered by a person's physical environment and lifestyle choice, such as diet, exercise, and tobacco. So see, the nature load the gun, okay, the gene, but the environment is pulling the trigger. The environment pulling the trigger. That's the expressed genome. They look this at the alphabet, but this is already once the alphabet, the expressed genome already can make out of the alphabet words and problems. So that's something, not just be blind-minded and think that genome is the gene is everything. The surrounding, the lifestyle, all that what really create the problem for the genome to be called the expressed genome. Utility of cardiac biomarker in the future will be great. That will be, I talked about. Steve Kopesky did not talk about LP little a, which is one of his favorite things, about some new biomarker, which is very promising. BNB is another thing, troponin, and so forth. This is a biomarker. This is another area which will flourish very much in the future. For biomarker might turn to be your best friend in the future for cardiovascular risk assessment. So that, because why? Because the traditional risk factors today cannot fully explain disparities to cardiovascular disease and the course of its recurrence in susceptible individuals. That's the reason we need to do that. We need to look at risk factors, but also need to look at risk marker. We need best to combine both in order to make a good assessment for your cardiovascular risk. The future biomarkers, great. So cardiovascular prevalence and costs are projected to increase substantially in the future. It is fortunate that cardiovascular disease is largely preventable. Our healthcare system should promote prevention and early intervention. That is the statement of the American Heart Association. The findings indicate cardiovascular disease prevalence and costs are projected to increase. Effective preventive strategies are needed if we are to limit the growing burden of cardiovascular disease. Therefore, a greater focus on prevention may alter this cardiovascular disease projection in the future. And I say now, you take this message with you home, time to reward the preventionist, not the interventionist, okay? There should be a group, because till now they have not been rewarded, and that's the reason we have not seen much progress. So remember the term preventionist, okay? Time to focus on personalized medicine. That's very important to do that. And before I go back here, thank you, and I will be more than happy to answer any question. And if you like our meeting, remember next year will be about the same time, first week in February. Any questions? Thank you. I will hold questions for later on because we have panels so that we don't take time. And now.